The Forgotten Cabin. When I was a child, my parents often took us to our family's old cabin in the woods. It was a small, rustic place, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. There was no electricity, no running water, just the bare necessities. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the world outside ceased to exist. I remember the smell of pine and damp earth, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I remember the silence, the deep, almost oppressive quiet that hung over the forest like a shroud. It was a place that both fascinated and frightened me, a place where the boundaries between reality and imagination seemed to blur. The cabin had been in our family for generations, passed down from my great-grandfather to my grandfather and then to my father. It was a place of history, of memories, of secrets. My father often told us stories about the cabin, tales of the strange and eerie things that had happened there over the years. Most of them were just that, stories. But there was one story that he never told, one that he kept to himself, locked away in the deepest recesses of his mind. I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, the cabin was just a place to escape the city, to explore the woods, to get lost in my own little world. But as I grew older, I began to notice things, small, unsettling things that didn't quite add up. There was the cellar, for one. My father always kept it locked, and he never let us go down there. "It's just storage," he would say if we asked. "Nothing to see." But I remember the look in his eyes when he said it, the way his voice would grow tense, as if he was hiding something. Then there were the strange noises at night, the creaking of the floorboards, the soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to come from the walls. I would lie in bed, listening, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. My brother and sister never seemed to notice, but I did. I always did. But it wasn't until I was a teenager that I truly began to understand the darkness that lingered in that place. It was the summer of my 16th year, the last time we went to the cabin as a family. My brother had just turned 18 and was preparing to go off to college, while my sister, 3 years younger than me, was still lost in the innocence of childhood. My parents decided it would be our last big family trip before everything changed. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked the same as it always had, weathered and worn, yet somehow still standing, still defiant against the passage of time. My father unlocked the door, and we stepped inside, greeted by the familiar smell of dust and old wood. For the first few days, everything was normal. We hiked, we fished, we roasted marshmallows by the fire. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense of something unspoken hanging in the air. My father seemed distant, preoccupied, his eyes constantly darting toward the forest, as if he was expecting something or someone to emerge from the trees. Then one night, everything changed. It was late, the fire had died down, and we were all preparing to go to bed when we heard it, a loud rhythmic banging coming from the cellar door. My father froze, his face draining of color. My mother looked at him, fear in her eyes. My siblings and I stared at each other, unsure of what to do. The banging continued, louder and more insistent, like something was trying to break free. My father grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the cellar, my mother close behind him. "Stay here," she whispered to us, her voice trembling. "Don't move." We watched as they disappeared into the darkness, the light from the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The banging grew louder, more frantic, and then suddenly it stopped. There was a long, tense silence, and then we heard it. A blood-curdling scream, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My sister started to cry, and my brother grabbed her, pulling her close. "Stay here," he whispered to me, his voice shaking. "I'll go check." But before he could move, the cellar door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The only sound was the rapid thudding of my heart, pounding in my ears like a drum. I reached out for my brother, but he wasn't there. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything around me, and for a terrifying second, I felt like I was floating in a void, lost in the blackness. Then a small, dim light appeared, a flickering, sputtering beam coming from my father's flashlight, lying on the floor just a few feet away. I scrambled toward it, my hands trembling, and picked it up, shining the beam around the room. The cabin was empty. My brother, my sister, my parents, they were gone. The only thing left was the open cellar door, a gaping black hole in the middle of the floor, like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I stared at the cellar door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made, only terror. And then from deep within the cellar, I heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something being chewed, followed by a low, guttural growl. Something was down there. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I had to get out of there. I had to find my family to escape this nightmare. But as I turned to run, the cellar door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I was alone, in the dark, with whatever was down there. I shone the flashlight around the room, searching for any sign of an exit, but there was nothing. The windows were barred. The door was locked from the outside. The only way out was through the cellar. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced myself to move forward, my legs shaking. I had no choice. I had to find my family, to save them from whatever horror was lurking below. As I approached the cellar door, the growling grew louder, more insistent, like it knew I was coming. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle, fear coursing through my veins. But I couldn't stop now. I had to be brave. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and pulled the door open. The smell hit me first, a foul, rancid stench that made my stomach turn. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my hand, and shone the flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only the first few steps, slick with some kind of dark, wet substance. I took a cautious step forward, my heart racing, and then another. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the darkness. I could hear the growling, closer now, just beyond the edge of the light. My hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight wobbled, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then, just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the light caught something. A figure, crouched in the corner, its back to me. It was large, hunched over, its limbs twisted and misshapen, covered in matted, filthy fur. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned slowly, its eyes glinting in the darkness, and I saw its face, a grotesque, monstrous thing, half human, half beast, with sharp, jagged teeth and glowing red eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature snarled, its lips curling back to reveal rows of sharp, yellowed teeth, and then it lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered across the floor, the beam flickering out, leaving me in total darkness. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing, feel its hot, rancid breath on my face as it loomed over me, its claws inches from my throat. And then, just as it was about to strike, the cellar door slammed open, and a blinding light filled the room. The creature screeched in pain, recoiling from the light, and I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it at the thing. It backed away, snarling, its eyes narrowing to slits as it was forced into the corner. And then, without warning, it turned and bolted up the stairs, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there panting, my heart racing, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I had to get out of there. I rushed up the stairs, out of the cellar, and into the cabin. The light was still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, but there was no sign of the creature. I had to find my family. I had to get them out of there before it was too late. The cabin was deathly quiet, the silence only broken by my ragged breathing and the faint creaking of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. My hands were slick with sweat, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee from this place and never look back. But I couldn't leave without my family. I moved cautiously, shining the flickering beam of the flashlight around the room. The cabin, once a sanctuary of childhood memories, now felt alien and foreboding, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The furniture, the old rugs, the dusty shelves, all were just as they had always been, yet now they seemed twisted, wrong, like pieces of a nightmare come to life. I called out softly, "Mom? Dad?" My voice was weak, trembling, but the words echoed back at me, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. No answer. I edged closer to the door that led outside, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But before I could turn it, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the direction of the cellar. I froze, heart pounding, and slowly turned my head. The cellar door was still wide open, a yawning black maw leading into the depths below. The growl came again, louder this time, more menacing. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. I had to get out. I had to get my family out. Without wasting another second, I threw open the cabin door and bolted into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it did little to clear the haze of fear clouding my mind. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching at my skin, the flashlight's beam bouncing erratically as I ran. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Where are you?" My voice was lost in the vast expanse of the forest. The trees loomed tall and shadowy, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the moonlight. It felt as though the forest itself was conspiring against me, drawing me deeper into its depths, away from safety. But then I heard something. Soft footfalls, rustling leaves. I turned sharply, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. "Mom?" I whispered, hope flaring in my chest. But it wasn't my mother, it was my brother, emerging from the darkness, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn, but he was alive. "Thank God!" I gasped, rushing toward him. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip tight, almost painful. "We have to go," he said urgently, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here now." "What happened? Where are Mom and Dad?" He shook his head, his eyes darting nervously around us. "I don't know. I heard something in the woods. It wasn't human. We need to leave before it finds us." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We can't leave without them. We have to find them." "They're gone," he snapped, his voice cracking with fear. "Whatever that thing was, it got them. We're next if we don't leave now." I wanted to argue, to insist that we couldn't abandon our parents, but the terror in his eyes stopped me. He was right. We were in danger. Whatever that creature was, it was hunting us. If we stayed, we would die. "Okay," I whispered, swallowing the lump of fear in my throat. "Okay, let's go." We turned and ran, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness as we stumbled through the trees. The forest was a maze of shadows, every sound amplified by the silence around us. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the pounding of our own footsteps. But then, as we rounded a bend in the path, we skidded to a stop. There, standing in the middle of the trail, was the creature. It was even more grotesque in the moonlight, its twisted limbs and matted fur slick with blood. Its red eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and its lips curled back in a snarl, revealing those sharp, yellowed teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver of terror down my spine. We were trapped. My brother took a step back, his breath hitching in his throat. "Run," he whispered, "run!" But there was nowhere to run. The creature blocked our path, and the dense forest loomed on either side. We were surrounded with no way out. The creature tensed, ready to pounce, and then, from somewhere behind us, a blinding light erupted, flooding the forest with an intense, searing brightness. The creature howled in pain, recoiling from the light, its twisted form writhing in agony. I turned, shielding my eyes from the glare, and saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, holding a powerful flashlight. The figure stepped forward, and my heart leaped as I recognized the face. It was my father. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice fierce and commanding. "Go now!" He didn't need to tell us twice. My brother and I turned and ran, our feet pounding the forest floor as the creature's agonized screams echoed behind us. I didn't look back, too terrified to see what might be happening. We ran until we burst through the tree line into the clearing where our car was parked. My brother fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, before finally unlocking the doors. We threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut behind us. As the engine roared to life, I dared a glance back at the cabin. The light was still blazing from the forest, but the creature was nowhere in sight, and neither was my father. "Go!" I shouted, and my brother didn't hesitate, flooring the gas pedal and sending the car hurtling down the dirt road. The cabin, the forest, the creature, they all disappeared into the night, swallowed by the darkness as we sped away, leaving everything behind. We never spoke about that night again. Not to each other, not to anyone. Whatever happened in that cabin, whatever my father had done to save us, it was a secret we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. But deep down, I knew the truth. The cabin had always been more than just a place to escape. It was a place of history, of memories, of secrets, dark, terrible secrets that had been buried for generations. And now, they had finally been unleashed. I never saw my father again after that night. He disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the darkness, just like the creature. My brother and I never returned to the cabin, and as far as I know, it still stands there, forgotten and abandoned, a relic of a past best left buried. But sometimes in the dead of night, I dream of that place, of the smell of pine and damp earth, of the eerie silence that hung over the forest like a shroud. And in those dreams, I hear the growl of the creature, the creak of the cellar door, and my father's voice calling out to me from the darkness. Run! Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing.